In May, after the death of George Floyd in broad daylight under the knee of a police officer, the country erupted in outrage. White people were asked again to check their privilege. And many companies and organizations scrambled for diversity trainings and educational tools for employees. And in the theater world, a public Google Doc was made documenting theaters that did not speak out against injustice against Black people. The We See You White America Theater campaign released a 31-page document of demands written on behalf of Black, Indigenous, and people of color theater makers. The document addresses the necessary redistribution of power and funding, the prioritizing of anti-racist practices, and the decentering of whiteness, and outlines several measures towards a more equitable, safe industry. Trinity Street Players has been keeping detailed records on diversity for the past 3 years, noting where there are gaps in representation and working to actively address that inequity. Diversity records include information on race, age, gender, sexual orientation, and disabilities. We definitely have room to improve, but we're staying positive about the opportunities that TSP artists have had thus far. I've had the pleasure of interviewing 3 of TSP's distinguished alumni. Here's Lane Michael Stanley, who wrote The Tiny Banger, Khali Sykes, who performed in The Tiny Banger, and Dasher Dancer Prancer, and playwright Manuel Zarate, who directed Our Town, Lone Riders, and Godspell for TSP.
Equity has an inherent analysis of how power is functioning across how people are being represented. A theater reflects the community that it lives in, right? That it's not just the white people of the community who are allowed to make work, or the cis people of the community, or whatever. And that is reflected at every level of production, that it's not just the folks on stage that can be seen.
If I'm in an audition room and I go in for a part and they're saying that they're like, oh, anybody, all ethnicities are welcome, all races, all sexes, all genders, whatever. And then I get an email back that's like, hey, you're being considered because we're going in this more diverse direction. But if we go a different way, then you won't be. What is that? What is that?
We're starting to talk about theaters that are using diversity as an aesthetic, right? And then backstage, that you're still having kind of the same problems, the same whitewashing, the same heteronormativity that we've always had, but that we're looking holistically at who is in leadership positions, who is making key artistic decisions for companies as a whole and for productions, and that we're seeing representation across every level.
I mean, we come in with our own baggage, but if you are not identifying what baggage you are bringing in and how that might hinder you, and it may benefit you in some ways, that's all a part of the work. I think that translates into then the stories that you pick, who you pick to tell those stories.
Equity, we're starting to hear things like forced diversity, right? And the reality is that we've had forced whiteness for an incredible amount of time, or we've had forced heteronormativity for an incredible amount of time.
That's what equity in theater, that's what it looks like to me, is that a reckoning of the self before you even get into a process.
Like, we're seeing a lot of like checkbox shows of like, okay, we're going to do our normal season, but then in February we're going to have a Black show, or we're going to do this one trans show, right? And then like that same kind of like opening the doors of inclusion, it's like relegated to this one slot, instead of like, how can we make all of our shows and all of our spaces more inclusive to all kinds of artists.
I thought you were a Latino playwright because your product, where's the Latino experience? Where's the Latino story? And my response has always been, I'm a playwright and I'm writing from my story and my experience, and the Latino aspect is part of what I am. So are you basically asking me to write something that where we got sombreros and we all talking like this? And I think that's because it's part of a pandering to the audiences and to the institutions that want to give dollars to that. And that's the sad part about it, because the intent is a good intent, but it's it's locked into a system that doesn't allow the organization to break away from it.
You know, for me, it's a difference with working with people who look like me and working with people who don't look like me and are for me, and working with people who don't look like me and don't care about me, right? They're kind of like three different experiences. And if I could have more of the don't look like me, for me, and look like me and are for me, that would be ideal.
It's really hard for trans actors because casting directors don't know how to cast them, right? And they, like, if a casting director is unsure about what gender someone reads and they don't know what gender they would want to play, and they don't know how to ask, because those are questions that you can politely and professionally ask. What gender identities are you willing to play? It's not like that hard of a question. But if a casting director or a director doesn't have that knowledge and that skill set, or think that they're going to confuse the audience, or that like having a trans person on stage is going to have to be a whole thing, like that there's no casual existence of trans people that can happen in any of their shows, then trans actors don't get cast, right? And so now we're in this moment right now of like it being really important that trans characters are played by trans actors, because if trans actors can't play cis actors or cis characters, and they also can't play trans characters, that's all the characters, right? And so there's just no space for trans actors.
So if you have a role, but you don't have anybody in your life that matches that, even though that role, right, unless it's based on some big, monumental, racial, sexual, gender experience, it's just a human being, right? And if you don't see people like me as a human being, of course you won't cast me as that character. Of course you won't, because I'm not a full, breathing, hurting, happy, joyful, angry person. I'm not capable of that in your imagination and fully living. So that was eye-opening for me, and that even the people that I trust that are around me are still limited in the way that they view me, people who look like me, other people from marginalized communities, and from a casting perspective.
When you're writing a character list, you're writing job posts, right? You're calling people into a room and deciding who's going to get to be there. And so if you have a playwright who's doing that responsibly, then so much of the work is done, even before it reaches the institution.
We have to keep growing, and that means having new voices, having new conversations, introducing people to new ways of thinking, new people.
I want to see what are the processes, what are the elements, or how do we create those things that create a sustainable change without an individual. So if Lane's voice or Khali's voice or my voice or anyone's voice drops out of the picture, it keeps going because the foundation is laid down there.
Because my first instinct, when you ask if there's room for improvement, is like, when would there not be? You know what I mean? And so I think it's kind of exciting to picture, like, what do we want the community to look like, where we would say, like, okay, like, we did it.
We need to put our money, the limited money that's out there for the arts, into the voices that are representing our community, our society right now.